Hello, everyone, and welcome to Economic Frontlines. I'm Michael Reynolds, and today we're diving into a crisis that's reshaping the future for millions of young people across the Western world.
And I'm Emma Chen. Today's episode focuses on what many are calling the defining economic challenge for Millennials and Gen Z, the growing problem of affordable housing in the United States and Europe. Michael, this is something that affects so many aspects of young people's lives, from career choices to family planning to mental health.
Absolutely, Emma. And what makes this topic particularly fascinating is how differently the housing crisis manifests in the U.S. versus Europe, despite some striking similarities. Before we dive into the details, let's frame the problem. Housing costs have skyrocketed in recent years on both sides of the Atlantic, far outpacing wage growth.
That's right. In the U.S., according to recent Census Bureau data, 31.3% of American households are now considered cost-burdened, meaning they spend more than 30% of their income on housing. For renters specifically, that figure jumps to nearly 50%. That's half of all renters in America struggling to afford their homes.
And the situation in Europe isn't much better. Between 2015 and 2023, house prices in the EU rose on average by 48%. In some countries like Hungary, the increase was a staggering 173%. Meanwhile, rents have increased by 22% since 2010. What's particularly concerning is that young Europeans are disproportionately affected. 26% live in overcrowded conditions compared to 17% of the general population.
I think it's worth noting how this crisis is playing out in both regions. In the U.S., the problem seems to be particularly acute in coastal cities and economic hubs. San Diego, Los Angeles, Sacramento. In these cities, nearly 3/4 of Gen Z renters are rent-burdened. The American dream of home ownership is becoming increasingly out of reach for young people.
While in Europe, there's significant variation across countries. In southern and eastern European nations like Croatia, Greece, and Italy, over 70% of young adults live with their parents, partly due to cultural traditions, but increasingly because of economic necessity. Meanwhile, in Scandinavian countries like Denmark and Finland, that figure is below 20%.
Speaking of living with parents, Michael, I saw some really interesting data from Pew Research Center. While many Americans might assume this is primarily a U.S. phenomenon, young Americans are actually less likely to live with their parents compared to their European counterparts. In the U.S., about 1/3 of adults ages 18 to 34 live with their parents. But in many European countries, that figure is much higher.
That's a fascinating point, Emma. There's often a perception that young Americans are failing to launch, but comparatively, they're more independent than many of their European peers. Of course, this comes with trade-offs. Americans might be living independently, but are often severely rent-burdened as a result.
Exactly. And this gets to something I find particularly interesting about the comparison: the different ways these societies structure their housing systems. The U.S. has historically been very house-centric, with a strong emphasis on single-family homes and home ownership as the primary path to wealth building.
Whereas Europe tends to have more apartment living, particularly in city centers. European cities often have buildings with retail on the ground floor and apartments above. Mixed-use development that's only recently becoming more popular in American urban planning.
And perhaps the biggest difference is in how the two regions approach social housing. In the U.S., public housing has declined significantly and carries a strong stigma. But in many European countries, particularly in Austria, Denmark, and the Netherlands, social housing makes up 20% or more of the housing stock and serves a broader swath of society.
That's right. The European model often sees social housing as serving not just the poorest residents, but middle-income households as well. It's less stigmatized and more integrated into urban planning. Though it's worth mentioning that even in Europe, The share of social housing has been declining over the past decade, dropping about 3 percentage points to 8% of total housing by 2021.
Michael, I think we should talk about one of the most concerning aspects of this crisis, how it's affecting wealth inequality across generations. Home ownership has traditionally been the primary way middle-class families build wealth. If younger generations can't access this path, what does that mean for their long-term financial security?
That's a crucial point. In the U.S., among households headed by someone born in the 1940s, about 70% owned their homes by age 35. For those born in the 1960s, that dropped to 60%. And for millennials born in the 1980s, it's down to around 50%. That's a dramatic shift in just a couple of generations.
And the wealth implications are stark. The median young household today is less wealthy than a similar household was 20 years ago. While some young people are participating more in the stock market, those investments are concentrated among higher earners and don't make up for the missing housing wealth for most people.
Let's talk about some of the causes behind this crisis. In the U.S., the housing supply shortage is a major factor. After the 2008 financial crisis, construction of new homes plummeted and never fully recovered. The entry-level housing market has been hit particularly hard. In 2023, only 87,000 new single-family homes under 1,400 square feet were built, down from 186,000 in 2004.
Meanwhile, in Europe, a similar supply shortage exists, but there are additional factors at play. Short-term rentals have taken many properties off the market in tourist destinations. Building costs and regulations have increased, and in some urban centers, foreign investment has driven up prices beyond what locals can afford.
And we can't ignore the role of financialization, the treating housing primarily as an investment asset rather than a place to live. In Europe alone, large investors now own more than 1.7 trillion euros worth of homes. This drives up prices and can lead to displacement of long-term residents.
So how are young people coping with this situation? In the U.S., we're seeing more young adults living with roommates well into their 30s. Co-living arrangements are becoming more common, and as we mentioned earlier, about 30% are living with their parents. CNBC recently reported that for many, this isn't just a temporary measure to save money, it's an economic necessity to avoid homelessness.
In Europe, the response varies by country. In Southern European nations, multi-generational living was already culturally common, but economic factors have intensified this trend. In Northern and Western Europe, there's been a rise in cooperative housing, where residents collectively own and manage their buildings. And across the continent, there's been increasing political activism around housing issues.
Speaking of political responses, let's discuss how policymakers on both sides of the Atlantic are addressing or failing to address this crisis. In the U.S., the Biden administration has set ambitious goals for increasing affordable housing supply with recent grant allocations of $5.6 billion for community programs. But given the scale of the problem, many experts argue this is just a drop in the bucket.
And in Europe, we're seeing the EU take a more active role than in the past. For the first time, the European Commission now has a commissioner specifically responsible for housing. The European Parliament has also recognized adequate housing as a fundamental human right that should be enforceable through legislation. But implementation largely happens at the national and local levels, with wide variation in approaches.
One interesting policy debate concerns rent control. Some European cities, like Berlin, have implemented strict rent caps, while others have opted for more flexible regulations. In the U.S., rent control exists in some cities, like New York and San Francisco, but is actually prohibited by state law in many places. The economic evidence on rent control's effectiveness is mixed at best.
What's clear is that there's no single solution to this complex problem. Increasing supply is crucial, but so is ensuring that new housing is actually affordable for those who need it most. And any comprehensive approach needs to address issues like zoning restrictions, construction costs, and the balance between housing as an investment versus housing as a basic need.
Michael, one aspect we haven't touched on yet is the psychological impact of housing insecurity on young people. Research shows that housing stress contributes significantly to anxiety and depression. And there are broader societal implications. Young adults are delaying marriage, having fewer children, and putting off other major life decisions because of housing uncertainty.
That's an excellent point, Emma. There's a real risk of a lost generation whose life trajectories are fundamentally altered by their inability to access stable, affordable housing. And this has ripple effects throughout society, from lower birth rates to decreased community engagement to reduced economic mobility.
Looking ahead, are there any innovative solutions emerging that give you hope? I've read about new construction technologies that could significantly reduce building costs, like 3D printing and modular construction. And some cities are experimenting with community land trusts to create permanently affordable housing.
Those are promising developments. I'm also encouraged by the increasing recognition that this is a systemic problem requiring systemic solutions. In the Netherlands, for instance, there's been success with public-private partnerships that create mixed income developments. And in Vienna, Austria, about 60% of residents live in subsidized housing, showing that large-scale affordable housing is possible with the right policies.
I think one thing that's clear from our discussion is that both the U.S. and Europe have something to learn from each other. The European model of social housing serving broader segments of the population could be instructive for American policymakers. Meanwhile, Europe might benefit from some of the innovative financing mechanisms being developed in the U.S.
Absolutely. And ultimately, addressing this crisis requires political will and a fundamental shift in how we view housing, not just as a commodity or investment vehicle, but as a basic need and a human right. Until that shift occurs, young people on both sides of the Atlantic will continue to face significant challenges in finding a place to call home.
Well said, Michael. And for our listeners who might be struggling with these issues themselves, remember that this is a systemic problem, not a personal failure. Collective action and advocacy can make a difference, and there are resources available to help navigate these difficult housing markets.
Thank you for that important reminder, Emma. And thank you to our listeners for joining us today on Economic Frontlines for this discussion on the affordable housing crisis facing young generations in the U.S. and Europe. We hope this comparative perspective has provided some useful insights into this critical issue.
If you found this episode valuable, please share it with others who might benefit and subscribe to Economic Frontlines wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, I'm Emma Chen.
And I'm Michael Reynolds. Take care, everyone.